Hello again, everyone. So for today's video, I wanted to try to tackle a subject that I see a couple different iterations of, sort of across the board, if you will. And that is the question of whether or not fairies evolve. And we see this sort of directly as a question that people will ask, and we also see this by implication in some of the ways that people approach fairies and fairy lore and folklore more generally, because there tends to be a lot of romanticism that goes on. I touched on this a little in a previous video of talking about what fairies look like, how they might dress. There's just a sort of a widespread habit of people tending to anachronize them and want to see them as beings that would appear dressed as they would have been hundreds of years ago, or very, very old-fashioned, or in various other ways sort of outside of the modern human timeline. But that leads to the question of, if that's true, why would it be true? And how exactly do fairies and humans sort of interconnect in a wider sense? So I wanted to look today at the more precise, if you will, question of, do fairies evolve? The quick answer to that, if you only want to watch a couple minutes of this video, is yes. They clearly do. We have quite a lot of evidence, particularly modern anecdotal evidence, that shows that fairies are not just sort of stuck in one specific time period. I think there's reasons why a lot of people tend to view them that way. And the biggest reason is that we have this period of written folklore that pretty much goes from about the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, which usually is preserving or recording older stories or putting stories in the context of the previous century or so. So what we end up with is sources like Knightley, Crocker, Hyde, for a few off the top of my head, where the stories they're telling, the folklore that they're preserving, is the folklore of their parents' or grandparents' time, and therefore is going to be 18th century and very early 19th century material. And this becomes sort of the template that people today look at fairies with. And instead of understanding in the context that people, when they were telling the stories, would have been telling them within that same general time frame that the stories are set in, because they were originally oral stories, of course. Now we tend to look at them as if that story from 1845 or 1888 or what have you is an example of fairy interactions in general and today. So we see people whose expectations with fairies are that they are very antiquated. And this, of course, also plays into the idea of fairies as nature spirits or elemental beings, which tends to be viewed through a very primitive lens. It's sort of the noble savage of folkloric and mythic beings. This idea that, of course, fairies would live in a very primitive manner, or, of course, fairies would dress in a very old-fashioned or primitive way. We see that the way some modern fairies are portrayed, wearing literally leaves and flowers and natural elements, things from nature. All of that, though, contributes to this wider idea that fairies exist outside of mainstream modern human culture in a way that's distinctively separating for them. And of course then leads into people viewing them as unchanging or not evolving. However, when we look at the breadth of the evidence, if you will, We do see that usually the stories that were being told depicted beings that were sort of contemporaneous to the people telling the stories. And when we look at modern anecdotal accounts, we see that in the modern anecdotal accounts, which we'll get into in more depth later in this video, people are not, for the most part, encountering beings that are stepping out in full Renaissance regalia, if you will, but are often in a more modern human appearance or context, which is sort of how it's always been. So that's sort of the easy, simple answer is off the top, yes, fairies do evolve, fairies do change. The more complicated answer, however, gets into why that is or why that might be, and really how true that entire concept might be as well. It's difficult with anything with fairies to make really strong factual statements, if you will. The folklore is often contradictory. We have a huge amount of it. And what is true in some cases or for some specific beings is often not true or directly contradicted in other cases. Sometimes outright antithetical things can be happening between different groups or between different stories or regions. So that all said, when we look at the potential deeper answers to do fairies evolve, the first thing we need to understand is that there is sort of this ongoing discussion or sometimes debate about whether when humans encounter fairies, they're actually encountering fairies as they are in any sense, or whether the fairies are always engaged in a sort of mimicry of humans. Why they would do that, there's multiple theories. Entertainment is often one that's mentioned. We do see a couple different examples of this, particularly in the older folklore. There's a fairly well-known one about a fairy funeral, where an observer sort of stumbled upon fairies enacting this funeral procession, supposedly for the funeral of one of their members. But it seems to have been sort of a game they were playing rather than an actual funeral. And it sort of sets up the idea of them mimicking what humans do, acting it out, if you will, rather than actually engaging in those practices. So that's one aspect of it. We also see in Reverend Kirk's writing, which would have occurred in the 17th century, he makes several references to specific types of beings, including something he calls the co-walker, that would engage in this same sort of mimicry. He refers to it as aping humans, where they go through these motions and sort of pretend to be doing what the humans are socially or culturally doing, but it's obviously a game to them. They're not actually doing it. So right off the bat, when we're looking at the deeper levels of do fairies evolve, we do need to keep in mind that this mimicry can be a factor, and that we can never know for certain when we see fairies doing a certain thing or engage with fairies anecdotally or in the material, how genuine their behavior really is. Are they playing at it as a game, or is this something that genuinely reflects a deeper thing among the fairies themselves? If we're sort of taking we might call it pseudo-anthropological view of fairies for this video. But that is an important question, and it is an important thing to understand that all of the material, when it relates to this, you do have to take with a little bit of a grain of salt, and just keep in mind that at any point, mimicry might be a factor. Now, secondarily to that, and sort of the bulk of the answer here, gets into symbiosis. And if we look at the entire breadth of the material we have, going back to the oldest stories we have relating of fairies, My particular focus is Irish, so the oldest stories that I tend to look at are the ones found in Irish mythology. Reasonably confident if you looked at them across, any particular culture, you would see the same thing. I could be wrong. If I am, please comment and let me know. But particularly looking at the Irish material and then the later Scottish, Welsh, Manx, Cornish, etc., Celtic language speaking material, we do see that there seems to be a strong indication of symbiosis occurring between fairies and humans, between humans and fairies. And what exactly the humans get out of this, I think might be a little harder to pin down and describe. Certainly, we have a huge amount of folklore. We have inspiration for our creativity. We have this connection with them. The stories that we have in the folklore paint a picture of them being much more dependent on humans than the other way around. But I do believe it is a truly symbiotic situation where that connection goes both ways. It's just a little harder to really specify what the humans are getting out of it. Certainly there are cases where the humans are not getting anything positive from it. There are other cases where they clearly are, whether that's knowledge or healing or monetary assistance, even in some stories. It's very multi-layered, but I do think it's harder to define the human end of this. I will be sticking to the fairy end, but I wanted to touch on that because symbiosis is a wide topic. When we look at symbiosis from the more fairy side of it, if you will, when we go back to one of the oldest stories in the Irish corpus of material, this would be the Ectra Fergosa MacLeady, which in writing dates to the 14th or 15th century, but many scholars, as far as I'm aware, believe that it most likely goes back into oral material into the 8th century. We also, of course, have the Ectra Condla, which goes back to the 7th, and Beveridge does suggest in her Children into Swans that it might even go back to the 5th century in oral material. That obviously can't be conclusively proven. My point here is just these are stories that are, most likely 1,000 years old or more. And when we look at those, the sort of extra tales, we see accounts of fairies, particularly socially, being structured very similar to the way that humans are at the time. A little bit still today, but particularly at the time these stories were being told and then recorded in. So we see references to fairies having kings and queens. We see references to them having servants and warriors and bards, even. The Irish would actually be file poets. Modern term is bards, which is actually kind of randomly entertaining to me because in the old poetic system in Ireland, the bard was actually sort of a minimal grade, fairly untrained poet. But somehow in modern terms, that's become sort of the term for a master poet. Little linguistic cultural digression there. But either way, we see these societal structures being explicitly mentioned that would have been very similar or reflected what we would have found in the human world at the time in those areas. So that to me indicates some sort of connection going on, a mirroring, if you will. And moving forward, I had mentioned Reverend Kirk a little while ago when I was talking about the mimicry. He also makes it clear that fairies have some sort of symbiotic connection with the cultures around them. He specifically talks about how he believes, based on his research and his information, that fairies have their own language, which is sort of indecipherable to humans, but that they will also speak the language of whatever population they happen to live near. And he mentions the Irish fairies speaking Irish, Scottish fairies speaking either Scots or Gaelic, or some cases English. And he also mentions the way that they dress, often mimicking or relating to the human fashions of that area. And I suppose you could debate whether that, specifically the dress, is a matter of mimicry or symbiosis. I think there's good arguments for either one. They could be doing it as a sort of fancy dress costume, or they could be getting their cues for their fashion from what happens to be in fashion among the humans around them. Either way, I'm putting it in the symbiosis category here, but I do think you could argue one way or the other. The language is clearly more complicated than mimicry. It's something that sort of interconnects with the specific cultures they're connected to. And Reverend Kirk went out of his way to mention that they have that connection to whichever humans they happen to be living around or near. So that's certainly an interesting point. William Butler Yeats in his Celtic Twilight, and Yeats, of course, is a somewhat complicated source and a little controversial. How accurately he recorded the things that he recorded is debated, and some folklorists really don't like him. But in his Celtic Twilight, he mentions one specific story of a woman who had a friend among the fairies, and the way he describes her, or I should say the way he says his source described her, is dressing the way that people of that area would have dressed about a generation before. So slightly out of date. And to me, again, this sort of reflects a kind of symbiosis where the fairies living in that area are sort of picking up on the human society as it shifts and changes, as the sartorial, trends go in and out, but not always entirely in line chronologically. And so we see this description of fairies wearing things that are slightly out of date, not to the degree of modern romanticism, but within a generation or two. It would be, to use a modern comparison, like someone today having an encounter with a fairy and the fairy being dressed in 90s grunge style from the US, or 1970s hippie style clothing, tie-dye and bell-bottoms, that kind of thing. It wouldn't be strange enough that you would think, wow, this is something that's clearly bizarre and not of this world. But you would certainly notice this is someone who is not dressing the way people today would normally dress, if that is understandable to everyone, that example. So we have those two considerations, specifically focusing on clothes. We also see mention in a couple of the essays, articles in the anthology The Good Folk, The Good People, edited by Narvaez, The Good People, New Essays in Fairy Lore, where several of them note basically the exact same things that Reverend Kirk and Yeats commented on, that the fairies in their areas would speak whatever language the humans of that area spoke, sometimes even speaking a language that was popular in the area, but that the specific human in question might not speak. So there are examples, and this would come from both The Good People and Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. There are examples of English-only speakers having encounters with fairy beings in areas that spoke Gaelic or Manx or Cornish, and the fairies spoke the Celtic language of that area, but not English. And I mean, these would be somewhat older accounts at this point, but that certainly to me kind of weakens the mimicry argument and lens more into symbiosis, that they had that strong connection with that local regional population, and that was how they had this language connection. We also see mentions, again, of clothing reflecting or being similar to styles worn in the area, sometimes slightly out of date or older, sometimes not, sometimes very contemporary to what people would expect to see. There's multiple references we can find in the work of Catherine Briggs to fairies having a sort of dependency on humans, and this goes beyond obviously the ubiquitous borrowed midwife motif. This is more things like fairies going to humans because they need to borrow a hand mill. A hand mill being a particular type of human technology used for grinding grain to make bread. If you didn't want to go to the huge mill, or your place didn't have a big mill, you would use a small hand mill. The closest thing I can equate it to for people that are not familiar with them is sort of a hand coffee grinder, if you're familiar with those. Either way, it was a specific type of human technology that for a period of time it seemed like the fairies did not have. And so they would approach humans and ask to borrow these things, always promising to return them, and so the stories would go. But the wider point here is that this clearly shows both that symbiotic connection and also that fairies did have that ability to evolve or adapt as things around them in the human world changed. So as this new technology, if you will, came in and humans started utilizing this, although initially the fairies did not have these items for themselves, they were keen to use them, and so they would reach out and sort of borrow from their neighbors, if you will. And then eventually this particular type of borrowing sort of phases out. And we could perhaps assume that it's because the fairies had figured out how to make them for themselves. That's entirely my supposition, by the way, but it would seem logical. It definitely indicates fairies using human technology and adapting to the use of human technology as it is phased in to particular areas, which of course lends support to the idea that they do evolve and change. We also see, for example, it's pretty well known in if you read any amount of folklore, that fairies will often need to borrow or ask a human to participate in their activities. And usually this is a reference to fighting or playing games. But one thing that we see, particularly in the Irish material, and again, you can find examples of this in Fairy Faith and Celtic countries, you can find examples of this on the Duchess.ie website, of fairies needing a human participant or a human referee to play a game of hurling. If you don't know what hurling is, you can Google it. It's a wonderfully entertaining game. Sport, I should say. A little more serious than a game. But hurling is a particularly Irish kind of game, and the fact that we see references and many examples of fairies playing hurling, I think also lends itself into this idea of this connection between the two cultures, if you will. The idea that we don't see fairies engaging in this particular type of sport activity in other areas where that sport activity does not exist, but we see it fairly well emphasized in Ireland where it's popular. So again, that symbiotic connection, that back and forth. You can also, of course, argue that the needing to borrow a human is in and of itself fairly symbiotic in nature. But I wanted to mention the game playing and the hurling as one example. There's other areas where we see, for example, fairies playing chess or engaging in other, human entertainment activities, which they then have obviously taken a liking to and adopted into their own culture. Again, how much of this is mimicry is impossible to say, but we see enough examples of this that it's pretty clear it is a thing. And I think that in my opinion, it leans more into the idea of symbiosis, of this deep and sort of long-term intimate connection between the two groups, rather than just all of it being them imitating us. Although, who really knows? When we move out of sort of the older material and into more modern anecdotal accounts, I think this is where we see really the strongest support for fairies evolving or fairies adapting into the modern world. And there's sort of two branches with this. Firstly, the idea that fairies have wings is not found in older folklore. It's actually not found in a lot of modern folklore either. It became popularized in the theater to indicate that an actor was playing a fairy. From there, it moved into artwork, and then eventually, around the 19th century, 20th century, into fiction, and only very, very recently into anecdotal accounts. But the fact that we are now seeing anecdotal accounts across the last 20, 30 years or so, where people who have been sort of steeped in and influenced by this popular cultural depiction are encountering these beings and describing them as tiny and winged, clearly shows some kind of adaptation or evolution. Now, whether this is purely an adaptation and evolution and how those beings are choosing to portray themselves or show themselves to us is an endlessly debatable point. Related to that, and along that same branch, we have this sort of endless debate between ufologists and fairy people, fairyologists, I guess we'll say. Fairyologist, by the way, is a Victorian term for people who studied fairies. It's mostly fallen out of fashion since the Victorian times. But we have this sort of endless debate between people who study or believe in UFOs and aliens and people who are more into fairies and folklore about whether potentially modern UFO accounts and modern alien abduction accounts are actually just modern versions of the same with fairies. So the logic here would be that as science fiction became a thing in the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, and as sort of the human consciousness, the zeitgeist, if you will, became permeated with this idea of beings from outer space and their potential interaction with humans, the old accounts of fairies abducting people or fairies encountering people slowly started to shift into aliens doing the same things. And that what was actually happening was the fairies were just adapting to what human expectations were and giving humans what they expected to see. So a lot of the things that we see between the two, between alien encounters and fairy encounters, are very similar. So it's not hard to imagine that they could have just shifted it a little bit, and they are very good with illusions and deceiving the human mind to make people experience what they would expect or be primed to experience anyway. So both of those, the wings and our aliens, actually fairies, concepts represent this one particular modern thread, if you will, of fairy evolution or adaptation, where they are changing how they interact with humans or changing how humans perceive them based on human expectations. And that, I think, we can strongly argue is a symbiotic thing. That as the human imagination paints them differently, as humans start to expect different things, they shift their own approach with us or to us to fit those expectations. The second branch we have with the modern anecdotal material is a little more straightforward, but simply that people who have had encounters with these beings or relayed encounters with fairies over the last 50 years into the 21st century, into 2020, not exclusively, but a percentage of them, a good percentage of them, I would say, describe beings who could potentially pass as human. And part of that is the way that they're dressed. These are not beings that people are encountering who are wandering around in, as I mentioned earlier, Renaissance gear or, medieval outfits. There's accounts, particularly in the fairy census, which I highly recommend people check out. The Fairy Investigation Society did a census, and it's up online. You can get the PDF for free, which is a collection of modern anecdotal accounts. But there's examples in there of people who encountered a being who there was clearly something a little otherworldly about them or a little not human about them, but they were dressed in a way that would fit in with their contemporary human surroundings. I have a friend whose husband and son, when we were all in Iceland in 2018, encountered a being at a waterfall who they believe was one of the Huldafolk, one of the Alfar, one of the Icelandic fairies. And again, he was not dressed in any way that was shockingly out of place or strange, but he was clearly acting in a way that was not human. We'll just say that. It's hard to really explain anecdotal accounts in a way that makes it clear that these are people who are confident that the experience they had was not with another human being. I realize skeptics will just simply say these are people encountering humans who are just a little odd. For the purpose of this, for the purpose of studying the folklore, we have to take the anecdotal accounts at face value, effectively. If people are saying that they believe it was a fairy, then we roll with that belief, as it were. Of course, there are accounts in modern anecdotal material of fairies that are tiny and have wings, of fairies that do show up in like Robin Hood style, Robin of Sherwood from the BBC style outfits. And again, I think that might lean into branch number one of them giving us what we expect to see. But we do also have quite an array of accounts. And I've talked with people who have had anecdotal experiences of their own. I should say, people have directly related their anecdotes to me of their experiences, which include seeing these beings dressed in what amounts to a contemporary human fashion. And again, that shows pretty clear evidence, in my opinion, of this evolution and this adaptation. They are not just stuck in amber at a certain time period where then they can't move forward and move out of that. There have been a couple people who have talked about having experiences of the land of fairy itself. John Beckett, who's a blogger on Pathos, is one who talked about experiencing a particular area of fairy, almost like modern American suburbs. And I've talked with several people who have experienced something sort of like a giant train station, modern cities. So I think it's clear from all of this, however we want to categorize this or conceptualize this, I think it is clear across the breadth of the folkloric material and the modern material that fairies do, in fact, evolve and adapt and change. They do that somehow in conjunction with humans, particularly with the human groups or cultures that they are most closely regionally connected to. So, and I want to emphasize that because I do think we need to be careful here to be clear that what we might see with fairies in a very, shall we say, industrialized first world area may be entirely untrue of similar beings in an area that is very different in nature, or very different culturally. And I think even if we look at accounts across, say, for example, England and Scotland and Ireland, and into the diaspora in North America, we can see that there is a difference and a variety in how they have adapted and how they have evolved. And this always seems to be occurring in conjunction with whatever human society they are most closely connected to. And that is how it has always seemed to have been historically. If we look at the oldest material, if we look at the sort of middle grade material like Reverend Kirk, mid-range, I should say, mid-range material like Reverend Kirk, it always seems to have related to those human communities that they're connected to, which is why I think there is a strong argument for symbiosis. It is not as if there's a monolithic fairy culture or culture of fairies in the other world that evolves and adapts sort of in its own terms, although they may very well, we don't know for certain, but the way they are encountered and the way they are relayed in modern accounts and in older accounts often shows this mirroring effect or mimicry or symbiotic connection on a deep level, intrinsic level to humans and specifically to the humans around them. So if we want to really, really dig into the subject, you would have to pick a particular area and sort of trace how the folklore of that area has shifted and changed over time to see how the fairies in that place, if you will, have evolved and adapted over time. And again, this is all coming from the perspective of viewing fairy folklore sort of as fairy anthropology or sociology or both. Certainly there are other ways that this subject can be approached and explained. If you're taking a much more skeptical view, you could argue that this represents the human imagination evolving and changing to make these beings fit into current situations. That would be another viewpoint. There's a whole other wide subject we could get into about the potential connection between fiction and literature and fairies and the development of fairies and how they shift and change, if they shift and change because of that. That would be, again, sort of a separate video to tackle because that's a very deep and complicated subject. But for our purposes here, I think we have pretty thoroughly gone over the evidence that we have. You can certainly view it as mimicry. You can view it as symbiosis, which is more what I tend to do. But I think the concept of evolution or adaptation among fairies can be pretty well established. And I think it's important, having gone over all of this, that we do keep this in mind, particularly in any context as we're viewing this subject, because there is that strong tendency in modern terms to romanticize them and sort of put them in this primitive viewpoint. We really do need to keep in mind that how limiting that is and how disconnected it is from the folklore and from the personal accounts across the years, if you will. So that's my final thought. We did kind of cover quite a bit in this video. I hope it wasn't too much or overwhelming, but food for thought at the very least. Sort of move forward and decide for yourself how you think this concept works, if you think it works. Feel free to completely disagree with me if you want. That's also fine. And I will be back at some point soon with another video. Have a great day.